So we've touched on mass production already with Todd's talks. So I'll run through this. What I'd like to do is show you the production system that we developed for Lubilosa. It's another low-tech system. And then run through some other ideas about how people think about production, whether you're going large-scale, small-scale, high-tech, low-tech, and look a little bit about economics and quality control. And then I've got a few slides of some different mass production systems that I've come across around the world in my travels.
Okay. All right. So when I started out in Lubilosa, there was a blank sheet of paper on how we might produce this fungal biopesticide, and I was presented with some options on how you might go about producing biopesticides. So there's a single stage, one option is a single stage liquid fermentation, and Todd touched on this earlier today when the Bolivians asked him whether they could just produce a blastospore product. Yes, you can grow fungus directly in pure culture. It's certainly effective as far as production goes. And it's the way that BT is produced, of course. So deep tank liquid fermentation technology is hailed as the most economic way of producing a fungal product, particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, for example. However, there are massive stability problems with things that are produced in liquid culture, and this is something that I don't really think has been cracked yet, certainly not with the production of spores or blastospores in liquid culture. The only technology I'm aware of is relatively new, and Stefan Juronsky and Mark Jackson have patented a product or a process where you produce Sclerotia in liquid culture, and these are these sort of tiny compressed sort of balls of mycelium, which are then dried along with some of the growth medium, which has nutrients still in it. So when you distribute that on the ground, it's really for a soil application. The fungus is revitalized and then sporulates around the outside of these sclerotia, or mycosclerotia as they call them, and you can inoculate the soil in that way. As far as the locust project was concerned, that wasn't a way to go. That technology didn't exist anyway, but we were looking at spraying spores in oil. And another issue with liquid culture is that if you do get blastospores produced, or even conidia produced, which is possible, they don't formulate in oil. They formulate really well in water, and they will not go into oil whatever you do. So we cancelled out the idea of doing single-stage liquid fermentation quite early on in the project, and looked at, as Todd already discussed, the two-stage fermentation, where you'll grow the fungus first in a liquid medium and then either tip onto trays to give a flat surface of sporulation, or add to a solid substrate so that you get sporulation all the way around the grain. And as far as production goes, having a larger surface area over which spores can be produced is to your advantage. So that's the way we went. The other option was, as Todd already discussed, was inoculating straight onto the solid substrate, and I think it might have been me that posed those three reasons why two-stage culture might be better, and I probably had some data to back up my claims at some point. Certainly never published it. But I'm glad you've corroborated it now, Todd. Yes. So here's the production plant in Cotonou. We went with shake flask rather than going with a fermenter. Again, this was looking at trying to cut down on any kind of contamination issues that you might get. You can easily inoculate shake flasks with spore suspensions. They grow. If individual shake flasks go down with any kind of contamination, you can throw those out, but you still get a production run out of the remaining ones. One big fermenter going down means that the entire run has to be scrapped. So it seemed like a safer policy, and this scaled up very well. So we had 2 shakers. There's enough liquid media there to inoculate more rice than you can deal with in a day. The second stage is to inoculate the rice. We used rice in this case, and rather than these rather nice sort of baker's trolleys that Todd has used, and you have here at Kwantlen, we used these plastic tubs because they were locally available. And we didn't have access to the spawn production bags, these nice bags that have windows in them that allow sterile air or aeration to pass through. We simply used these really cheap, what in England we call carrier bags. What do you call them there? Those stripy bags that you get for free at the supermarket?
Plastic bags.
Just plastic bags. If they're crispy, they autoclave fine. If they're the ones that stretch quite easily, they don't do well in the autoclave. But if they're crispy, they're going to be fine in the autoclave. So you can put cooked rice in those, autoclave them, and then inoculate them and plop them in these tubs. We had the tubs with holes drilled, and there's sponge plugging the holes just so that you get sterile air, sort of some kind of air exchange through them, and you can stack them up like that. Almost as good as the baker's system, but more colourful. And then we would open them up and cut the bags away. So this reduced the amount of dust that we created in the environment, transferring them from one thing to the next. We simply removed most of the bag, there's a little bit of bag underneath, and then allowed them to dry by stacking them on the crosses. And once they're dry, you can extract the spores. And we started off extracting with sieves, and this is our two-man sieve. They had good rhythm, and all of the spores would fall out at the bottom, and we would throw the relatively clean rice away. But then developed the Mica Harvester, and this is the first version of the Mica Harvester, which was actually built out of a vacuum cleaner made by Dyson. You're probably familiar with it. The next iteration I don't have a picture of, which I'm quite sorry about actually. It was 4 vacuum cleaners on a frame, with a great big tube that was connected to the back of a tumble dryer, and we would throw the sporulated rice into the tumble dryer, shut the lid, shut the door, and it would tumble, and the vacuum cleaners would suck all of the air out and extract the spores. So that was the that was the beginning of the development of the Mica Harvester system. And this is a picture of the rice sort of bouncing around like a bingo machine, where the spores are being removed and the air, with the spore-laden air, being taken out and separated using the cyclones. So there are advantages of the Mica Harvester. Safety, obviously, because it reduced the amount of dust that you get at processing in comparison to the two-man sieve. And we also got excellent physical properties of the formulation, in that the particle size spectrum was very, well, I'll show you actually. Here's the particle size spectrum. So the white line there is the number of particles. If you see the size along the bottom, you can see how the particle size goes up, the number of particles there are in certain size classes. So the green line is the best because it's got most of its particles that are less than 10 micrometers in size, okay? And whereas the white line with where we'd extracted with the two-man sieve, you can see that if you look at the 10 micron size, only 60% of the particles are 10 microns or less. And that meant that we could avoid blockages of our spray restrictors. If you've got large particles going through a very tiny orifice, you end up with blockages. This is the scaled up version. You've seen this already. It was built in Trinidad. It wasn't built for Lubulosa. Lubulosa didn't get one of these. And then we would dry the spore powder, and this is a drying box with all the spore powder here, with a dehumidifier connected, and you'd put a lid on there and you'd dry the spores down to 5% and check it with a moisture analyzer. And packaging in foil sachets, and once you've got your spores down to 5%, if you seal them, hermetically seal them in these aluminium sachets, then they have very long shelf life, and that's something that we investigated at quite some length to make sure that we had a product that was stable and would survive in the field even at higher temperatures. So shelf life. This is the sort of equation that horrifies me, still horrifies me. But what we did was we set up a collaboration with a group of seed scientists from the University of Reading. And they had built this model to predict the longevity of dried seeds over time. And basically this equation takes into account the fact that you've got an absolute longevity of any given seed, whether it's a seed or a spore, and it's affected by moisture content and temperature. That's what it says. You can trust me with the rest of it. What we did was we did a whole series of experiments to put values on all of these letters so that we could use that equation to predict how long our product would last at any given humidity or temperature regime or combination, even a fluctuating one. And to verify that model, we had some batches of Conidia that had been produced by the Lubilosa factory in Benin. We found 6 batches, or a number of batches. The ones with the open circle, they'd been produced up to a year ago. The open squares, 2 years, and the open triangles, 3 years, all the way up 4, 5, 6-year-old batches of spores that had been dried to 5% and stored in those aluminium sachets. And we found those batches and we assessed their viability using our standard germination tests, and we plotted the predicted viability, what we thought it would be, with the actual viability that we got. And you can see that all of these batches were fairly close to that line, but we were a little bit worried about some of these. And what we did was we realized that although these had been stored in the fridge, some of these batches that fell off the line had actually been taken out to the field with the intention of being sprayed, and then they had come back. But luckily, when they came back, we'd reassessed the viability. So we replotted the viability that they were when they came back to Ascot into the model, and then we got a much better fit of those ones that didn't look so good in the first place. So the model was working really well, and it's for sure, if you dry spores down to 5%, they store for a long time. And you can see we've got 6 years here. Of course, you can't, we were lucky, we knew that we'd taken our spores away, and then we had a germination test that we could do to see what had happened while they'd been kept at high temperature. But if you're a manufacturer and you're sending this product out, you'd really like to know whether those spores had been exposed to a very high temperature. And if you're the end user and you receive a packet of spores, how will you know how it's been treated in transit? So BCP, the company that we worked with, bought these viability indicators. It's a simple thing. If those packets are exposed to too high a temperature for too long a period, one of these little black spots will go black, and you'll know that these packets have not been treated well, and you should question the viability of the spores inside. Quality control. Things that we thought were important, and they are important, and these are the things that are missing in Bolivia, probably. So careful culture maintenance and preservation. So we had an isolate that we knew worked. We were very, very happy with it. But if you subculture an isolate on agar, and then you sub it onto agar, and then you sub it onto agar so that you keep it going, you can lose the virulence. It's called attenuation of the strain. You can lose all kinds of characteristics randomly. You can't predict what will happen. So you have to do long-term storage, and we store at -80 on these things called microbank beads, and you can store a large batch and then always go back to your cold storage to bring out your production batches, and that's the way to go. Don't keep subbing them. Just keep a big stock of your production source. As you do your process, monitor for contamination at every stage. So make sure that what you inoculate into your liquid is aseptic. It only has your fungus. Make sure that the liquid culture is not contaminated before you inoculate your solid substrate. And if you can't do it before, do it as part of the process, so that if you identify that there's contamination in the liquid, maybe even 2 days later after placing it out, you'll at least know that you can throw out the production batch because there is contamination there. So contamination monitoring at each stage. Check your viability at packaging, and then probably at formulation as well, if that's the second stage in your step. Monitor for the total contaminating organism count. Once you get to the point where you're drying, your process is no longer sterile. So there will be some level of contamination, just aerial contamination in your product, but it's no more than you would find on the loaf of bread that you bought from the market. You know, there's always going to be some kind of contamination count there. But you have to determine what is acceptable in your product and determine that you're within those limits at each time. Use a standardized bioassay to check virulence, and I would suggest that should be done each time you take a bead out of your -80. And then you know that each batch you're going to go through from that source is standardized with respect to virulence. And then there are other checks that may be appropriate to specific products. For us, we wanted the moisture content because we knew that that would result in longevity. The number of conidia per gram of product, which gives an indication of what it's the active ingredient. You don't want that to vary. And with the Mica Harvester, that's pretty standard. It separates all of the pure spores, and it doesn't maintain any of the cereal product on which it was grown. And then a particle size distribution, which is really important if you're spraying it. It's less important if you're just drenching it onto a field. So these are our specifications. We expected our product to be greater than 90% at packaging, greater than 80% by the sell-by date, by the viability indicator, 5% moisture content, contamination less than 0.05% by number. That's actually quite an easy figure to achieve. There should be 5 times 10 to the 10 spores per gram. That's what you get if you have pure metarhizium in pure spore powder. This is our particle size distribution, and then virulence should be greater than 90% mortality 5 days after inoculation. But a manufacturer has to decide what that is, but just to make sure that it doesn't vary. Formulation. So we decided that the dry spore powder, even though we could store it for a long term, was not the best end product. It's the active ingredient, but we needed a formulation which we would send out to the end user so that they didn't have clouds of spores when they were trying to mix spore powder with oil and so on. So we developed an oil miscible flowable concentrate, which has a sort of a season-long storage of about 3 to 6 months. And you send that out to the end user, who then simply dilutes it with a recommended carrier oil, and that makes the whole process much neater. Economics. So we had an economist come and visit us who was interested in setting up a production plant in Madagascar, and he wasn't sure whether he should go with what he called our labor-intensive model, or whether he should go with a capital-intensive model, such as that is used by Microtek, or who are now called Lavalam, who produce GHA in this sort of secret black box that nobody knows what goes on inside. But it's a capital-intensive system. And he wanted to compare our system with their system and make a decision on which one he would recommend was built in Madagascar. So to start off with, we looked at the yields and outputs from our production system. So we have the average yield and the best. So on average, our yield of conidia per gram of rice was 1.62 times 10 to the 9. We had an average throughput of 150 kilos of rice a week, and that gave us a total number of conidia of 2.43 times 10 to the 14, or enough for 48.6 hectares using our standard application rate. At best, we could get, the best run we ever did was 2.14 times 10 to the 9. The highest throughput we ever did in a week was 200, so therefore our maximum capacity was 4.28 times 10 to the 14, or 85.6 hectares a week. Then you look at startup costs. So he looked at the cost of starting up our production system, or mirroring our production system. And he reckoned if we were to have an output of 20,000 hectares per annum, it would cost $140,650 to set that up. And if we were to increase the scale of that and make a plant that was capable of 80,000 hectares, it would cost $309,000 to set up. Whereas the capital-intensive system, if Microtek would sell it to him, would be about $384,000 to produce 20,000 a year, $481 to produce 80,000 a year. So much more expensive to set up, but the difference between 20,000 and 80,000 is less than it would be for the labor-intensive model. So what else does he need to know? Then he looked at what he would need to sell the product at to break even operating either of those plants at capacity. So if he was operating our labour-intensive plant at a capacity of 20,000 hectares a year, we would have to sell the product, he reckoned, at $11.1 per hectare. And if we increased capacity, a much bigger plant to 80,000, it would cost $10 a hectare. Whereas with the capital intensive, at $20,000 a hectare, you've spent a lot more money actually setting it up, and it's still going to be more expensive to produce the product. But once you get to 80,000 hectares, it starts to come into its own. So it looks like you really need to gauge your investment in the kind of system that you set up on the expected output. Todd?
Am I interrupting?
Nope.
Okay. So you said if they were to get the stuff from Microtek, now, but is that factoring on, they would need to license it from Microtek?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's even possible, but Microtek did give him the cost of setting up that factory, but they did not give him the how to set up that factory, if you see. So he used the Microtek as a model.
Yeah.
There are actually other models. Profiter in Germany do actually sell their high-tech systems. So, and their costs may be different, and these figures may therefore change again. But we were quite encouraged that our labour-intensive system competed rather well, actually. And I think, for us, those results were kind of good. Yeah.
They had requested that, like a confidentiality agreement with the technology, right?
Who's that? Microtek. They didn't give him any details. They just told him, you'll need this piece of equipment and it will cost this amount. We'll need piece of equipment X and it'll cost this much. So, and if you want this entire plant to produce an average of 20K, it'll be this size, so it'll cost this much. And then he used their yield data to get these figures as well.
And the reason
Okay.
I'm asking is I just wanted to know how willing people were to let their technology break out of private use to public use.
Microtek are very unwilling.
Very unwilling.
Very unwilling.
Yeah, because you're right, it's a black box.
Yes.
What's in there, what are they doing, how are they doing it? And then we're on the outside reinventing, or not reinventing, inventing a public system, so it's like a private system and a public system for
Yeah.
mass production.
Yes, I found it incredibly frustrating back in the days of Lubulosa, but I felt I felt better when we got this result, I have to say.
When you were talking
Yes.
about labor intensive,
Yes.
how many people have labor intensive?
I think I've got something on that. Okay, so there's a cost breakdown. I think we're going to get there. So Dan Swanson looked at all of the individual costs of our production system. So staff and salaries was by far the highest cost in that. It is labour intensive indeed. There were some capital items, and he depreciated those as you do if you're an economist. He calculated overheads, the consumables, and the rice substrate. Look, it's only 7% of the total cost, and we got quite a lot of flack when we started setting up this system for using such a high cost food quantity to produce fungus on to protect a food commodity. But the actual relative cost is actually small, and we were thinking of using all sorts of waste products and so on, but really as a percentage saving we wouldn't have saved much anyway. The rice was a very small percentage of that total cost. Utilities, rent. And then there was a time and motion study to see where that labour went as well. So 25% of the time went on cleaning, and we cleaned those plastic buckets. Maybe we could have reduced our labour there if we'd said, okay, we're going to import proper mushroom spawn bags. That's going to cost more than our little plastic bags, but maybe we would have saved a considerable amount in our labour if we had done that. So there are things to look at there where you might be able to optimise the system a little better. Cooking the rice, Todd showed today that cooking the rice gave better yields, and we indeed found that as well. But it took 23% of the labour to actually go through that cooking and preparation stage. You don't have to cook barley. If we used barley, maybe we could have reduced costs there again. We'd have really slaughtered Microtek then. Yeah. No. Am I bitter? So there's the other. I don't know that there's anything very interesting to pull out of that, but all of these things were taken into account in that costing out. So optimizing economics. Yeah, the efficiency of your production system, work on yield, time and motion, increase your batch size. They're all economies. If you can reduce your field application rate, you're instantly saving. And we eventually, I think it might have been after the end of Lubulosa, reduced our field application rate from 50 grams per hectare to 25, and it worked just as well. So that made a big difference as well. And then look at expanding your market. Well, you know, the green mussel isolate really does only kill locusts and grasshoppers, but if you've got GHA, it kills a whole lot more than that. So you can expand your market, export, increase your product portfolio, and you gain through scale as well then. So some production systems around the world. I'll whiz through them because we've got a very interesting talk coming on Cuba. So I'll just whiz through these. This is a Chinese liquid stage fermentation. They're shake flasks, these funny bubble pots. They've even got fermenters. They produce Bavaria on trays in like these. This looks just like a mushroom farm to me. More tray systems, an autoclave that takes trays, and Chinese cyclones as well. This was the first place we saw the cycling technology actually in operation. And the Profiter black box looks like this, and you can buy it. Have you seen one ever,
No.
Todd?
Yeah, I have some pictures.
Yeah.
Not in situ, but the pictures.
Right. This is their schematic of it. I'm not sure that I completely understand it. It's a controlled system, so they can control the amount of aeration that goes in through their substrate, the humidity. They don't use a serial substrate. They use some kind of inert carrier and add a defined liquid medium to it. So it's really quite different to the system that we use, but it's highly controlled. And as I say, they now sell these as units. So rather than keeping it a secret, hopefully they're making money on the actual technology as well. Yeah, that's the picture of their substrate. It's these beads. And then Silva, and this was somebody that we identified as having a really nice industrial version of our labor-intensive system. So one of the keys to this is their Y-shaped autoclave. And this is their sterilizer, so you can this is their hopper. They put the grains into the autoclave direct. They can add moisture. It can tumble so things don't get compressed. They can mix in inoculum once it's cooled and then distribute this inoculated grain substrate straight down into bags. So that's relatively, pretty highly automated actually. But once it goes into the bags, it all becomes very familiar. It goes onto shelves, it goes into constant temperature rooms. This is all for mushroom spawn, but it could be adapted so easily for biocontrol products as well, processing. And the only thing that Silvan don't have is this extraction equipment, which we already developed. So labour-intensive production systems can produce high-quality products, and they're relatively cheap to set up, ideal for product development and good for small markets. If you are lucky enough to have a capital-intensive production system, well, they require a high degree of engineering, and I don't think anybody has the answer on how this is actually done. Those who do seem to keep it a secret. They are expensive to set up. They can be cost-effective, but require a large market. And there's always the possibility of toll manufacture. If you have a product out there, maybe you can get Silvan to produce it for you, and you don't even need to build a production plant. And that's it. Thank you.